Zertelo and the Quest for CastleOak by D.S. Arnauld. Read for you by the author. Chapter 15. Tired Old Muskrat. While the company passed into the starlight and cool air, the ghost night would not come beyond the threshold of the cave. Tloss rested on the ground a few paces off. Dgilu collapsed not far behind while his daughter looked on, helpless to ease his weariness. Zertelo looked back at the lingering ghost knight, who looked pale and was fading. "Half an hour's march from here, you will find a spring hidden in a secret meadow amid the endless barren waste. West by north, where no green can be hoped for, you may still find it." "Thank you," said Zertelo. "No, it is I who thanks you, Sir Zertelo," said the ghost knight with a low bow. "If only you could restore such virtue in the forest as you have in me. But then magic is magic, after all. It comes when least expected." His light transfigured from blue to white, brighter and brighter, until a rich gold, then faded into peaceful mist and was gone. "Now I have seen magic," said Tloss to Zertelo. Just as they were told, they found a spring only a short march away. They drank deeply and rested in the grass. While the others slept, Zertelo stood watch over the company, gazing at the tree line of the forest far away. Tloss woke once in the night and saw the lizard standing over the spring like a sentinel against the dangers of the night. Zertelo opened and closed his claw many times over his missing sword, and seeing this, Tloss marveled the knight had kept the will to go on. It proved, after all, that true bravery came not from weapons and armor, but from within. But if not from a knight's sword, then where? Such were the mysteries of his dreams as the tortoise slumbered safely till morning. "Dawn is not far off. We must choose which course to take from here," Zertelo said, rousing them in the early morning twilight. The company looked to Counselor Dgilu for guidance, but the muskrat sat hunched and silent. He appeared to have been greatly aged by his imprisonment. During the excitement in the cave, Zertelo had not had time to really look at the old muskrat. Some of Dgilu's brown fur had gone gray. A tuft of long, snow-white hair grew from his chin, making him look distinguished and scholarly. "Father?" called Gamilla softly. The old muskrat stared at the ground between his feet as though still lost in a terrible dream. He muttered something, shutting his eyes tight. His spirits were broken, and he could not meet his daughter's eye. "Should we not make for the colony?" Gamilla turned to him and tenderly took his feeble paw in hers. "The animals are depending on you. We have to get you back." "As you will, my child," Dgilu answered softly. "Father, what happened to you?" "The snake," began Dgilu. "The snake." A terror came over him, and he covered his face with his trembling paws. Just then a sparrow arrived. It flew straight down and landed beside Counselor Dgilu. It began whispering in his ear while the others had to wait to hear the urgent news it brought. Finally, the sparrow finished its report and flew away. "Something unspeakable is happening throughout the colony. Spiders, led by a rat general, have attacked in the night. The animals were driven out of their homes. Bats swooped down. The colony is scattered. The sparrow says they are wandering around in exile, looking for each other in groups." Zertelo's claw gripped for his missing sword. "A rat? Did the sparrow tell the name of this general?" "Yes," answered the old muskrat. "His name is General Radard." Anger rose in Zertelo. He would deal with his old friend sternly and as a knight. But for now, he put his feelings aside and turned to his companions. "We should have sent word with the sparrow, telling them where to meet you, father," declared Gamilla. Zertelo heard strength in her voice. She saw what needed to be done. That Counselor Dgilu seemed far away startled the lizard. This situation called for leadership. Why wouldn't Dgilu rise to it? "Please, father," Gamilla pleaded once more. "Tell us what is wrong." "My worst fear," he said in a small, trembling voice, his eyes staring at a horror only he could see. "We've brought this upon ourselves. How naive I was to the growing darkness." Dgilu waved a paw before his eyes and fell into despair. "All my ideas failed. There's so much darkness. The snake." Gamilla looked into her father's eyes, searching for the great leader he had been. "We overcame the dark magic by working together. Together, the forest can defeat the tyrant." Dgilu turned his head away and would not look at her. You were foolish to risk yourself to save me, he said. But then I was foolish to dream that freedom could live in our hearts. Would you have us hide then? Asked Camilla. Hide and endure. We can do no more, said Degulu solemnly. I've seen all reason for hope taken away. Zertelo strode across the grass to Degulu. He knelt before the aged muskrat and gently took his trembling paw. Hope is only hidden in a hawk-swollen shadow, Degulu. It can always be found. A familiar croaky voice behind him said, You have passed the second test. Chapter 16. Assembly at Parish Glen. Crogrog smiled at the lizard and said, Rise, my friend. You have passed the test of heart. But I, began Zertelo. Now, interrupted the wizard. I know all about your adventures since we last parted, and I'd say you've done quite well. There's no need to look like you spilt your cricket juice. After all, you wouldn't cry about that, now would you? Or at least you shouldn't, though I might if the cricket juice was particularly good. Zertelo rose, his blue tail sweeping merrily behind him. The others looked on in amazement, for they weren't used to the frog's rambling manner of speaking. But Crogrog, how did you find us? Asked Zertelo. I ran into someone we both know, Crogrog said, and though he had it on him, I believe this belongs to you. Light leapt from the wizard's hand. Zertelo's sword shone forth again, and Crogrog ceremoniously handed him the hilt. Walgarg had it, cried the lizard, taking back his sword. How? I thought it was lost, buried forever with the snake it slew. The snake you slew, corrected Crogrog proudly. It seems Walgarg managed to retrieve it just before the cavern collapsed. I found him way beyond the boneyard, up to no good as usual. But you know him? Cried Zertelo. He's an old friend, you could say, or was, but that is another tale. What did you do to him? Asked Zertelo grimly. I asked him to join our side in the fight ahead. He threw down a blast of crimson light and vanished again, and I let him go. You did what? Do you not know that he was behind Counselor Degulu's abduction? How could you want him on our side? How could he be trusted? He still has the potential to redeem himself. Remember, all life has value, Zertelo. I doubt we've seen the last of that wretched frog. Yet he will be held accountable for his misdeeds before his tales are through. But not this one. We have other matters more pressing. Yes, said Gamella. We must still decide on a place for the scattered animals in exile to meet us. What do you recommend, my lady? Said Talos. She looked back and forth between the lizard, frog, and tortoise on one side, and her dejected father on the other. Send out messenger sparrows to every corner of the forest. Have them gather together at the parish glen. That is a rallying point for war, exclaimed Counselor Degulu. They will not come. I believe they will, Father. No, Parish Glen is the southern tip of the same valley of CastleOak. The animals will never risk gathering in an open place so close to the tyrant seat of power. The same valley? Asked Zertelo. I've never been there, but your father may be right, my lady. If it is a gathering point in clear view of the enemy, we lose the element of surprise. But the valley is shaped like a crescent, she argued, drawing a map in the dirt. Parish Glen is here at the southern tip, as you said, and CastleOak is around the far sweep of the valley to the north. What is your plan, my lady? Asked Talos, thoughtfully studying the curved shape in the dirt. As the animals assemble in Parish Glen, a narrow, secluded wedge of the Crescent Valley, Belfar will see us and begin preparations to defend against an attack. He expects the main battle to happen southwest of CastleOak, yet we will send reinforcements through the woods where he can't see. Our second army will attack from behind them in the east. To do that would take every animal in the forest, Degulu said, shaking his head. Yes, said Crogrog. He took a deep breath, reared his head, and made a loud sound like many sparrows calling at once. And many sparrows answered. Within a minute, 50 or more sparrows flew toward Crogrog and perched in a half-circle before him. Thank you for coming, my valiant friends. Ever have you served the forest, yet never has it needed your swift wings so desperately. Go now, in every direction, north, south, east, and west, with the message. All animals
are to gather at Parish Glen."
Though small, the sparrows flew off with the force of a storm.
"We but gather them for the last doom,"
said Dgilu, and reluctantly fell in line as the company set off for the last gathering. In the morning light of the following day, Zertelo beheld the great assembly of animals at Parish Glen. Rabbits, skunks, otters, raccoons, badgers, hedgehogs, squirrels, foxes, chipmunks, rats, mice, moles, weasels, gophers, porcupines, woodchucks, ducks, possums, armadillos, and beavers. Every animal in the forest had come.
"It is time,"
Krog said to father and daughter. Gamella looked, but found no change in Dgilu's resolve. "I did not call this meeting," he said. "If you wish for a crusade, you will have to lead it." Gamella radiated the tremendous sense of purpose that Zertelo had come to expect from her. Unlike the first time he saw her, unsure of herself and afraid to speak, Gamella climbed the steps of the speaking stone without hesitation. Suddenly, the assembly fell silent. "We have received reports from loyal crow spies," Gamella announced. "Belfar is breeding thousands of spiders in pits around CastleOak in the north. It is an army." An anxious murmur spread over the crowd. Heads turned from side to side in fear of the great force so near. Many seemed ready to flee before it was too late. "The army is invading our homes. It is clear that Belfar's plan is not just oppression, but enslavement. The time has come to stand together, once and for all, to achieve a final victory over this tyrant and free the forest."
"What makes you think we can?"
demanded the cynical old badger.
"Where's the proof that we do not march to ruin and defeat?"
A chorus of doubtful voices joined the old badger. How could they overcome an army? What of the bats? And of the rats? Was it true they had a terrible new general? Then there was the hard question of Belfar himself. Who could ever vanquish the mighty hawk? "Together we have the strength," answered Gamella. "I have seen it in the two heroes who rescued my father. I now ask them to come and speak. Sir Zertelo and his steed, the steadfast Talos." They stepped forward. Again Zertelo heard the murmurs about a knight, his sword, the blue stripe. Then they saw the tortoise slowly climbing the steps to the speaking stone, struggling to catch up to the nimble lizard. Just as the laughter began, a clear voice rose from the rabble.
"I would like to hear what he has to say."
It was Krog, moving through the press of animals to stand in the front ranks. Seeing the wizardly respect for the tortoise, the host of animals decided to listen. Talos reached the summit. Zertelo nodded for him to speak, and Gamella stepped aside to allow him center stage. "We can overthrow this tyranny threatening to enslave us." "How?" called a rabbit. "Belfar's tyranny depends not on his strength to enforce the law, but on the common creature's unwillingness to choose what is good and right. For too long the forest has been entrapped in the shadowy walls of fear, yet we know right from wrong. This is your choice, not Belfar's. This is our forest. Individuals choosing to stand together. That is our power, and no one can take it away." High above came a long, harsh wail. A black shape swooped down and seemed to cut short the animal's hope. The bat landed on the speaking stone in the middle of the lizard, tortoise, and muskrat. It raised its claw in a sign of parley and called in a dry, foul voice, "Peace, peace. I come with a message from our Lord Belfar the Mighty." When they saw that deadly legions of his kind did not follow the bat, the assembly quieted down to listen. "First, we would speak with Counselor Dgilu," called the bat. But Dgilu waved his paw, saying, "I have no authority here." On hearing Dgilu's refusal, the bat turned to the three companions beside him on the speaking stone. "Are these three insignificant youths your chosen leaders?" laughed the bat. "Do so many of you put your faith in them? Let me tell you what will happen if you go against the might of Belfar. All animals who march on CastleOak will be crushed by an army of spiders and rats. But if you depart from this place and swear never again to assemble, Belfar will spare your lives," the bat said solemnly. Silence was the only answer until a young mouse, no larger than a stone, came to the front of the line and said, "The muskrat, tortoise, and knight do not choose my fate. I choose to fight!" The bat drew back in shock as the tiny mouse's conviction spread over the host of animals. Zertelo held his sword up in salute to the mouse. There is your answer. We fight. We know the dangers, but we choose to stand together. We fight for each other. Now, to CastleOak! To CastleOak! To CastleOak! Went out the cry, and the animals began arranging into ranks for battle. The bat flew off to warn his master of the animals' decision. Just as he was gone from sight, Gamella began putting her plan for a surprise force into motion. A regal fox with a tail shimmering like copper in the morning sun volunteered to lead this second force. Polyfire was his name, and many other swift-footed creatures joined him and set off into the woods, dashing to make it behind the hawk's army in time. "Let's begin," said Gamella, once all the preparations had been made. Krogrog shook his head, as though gently saying no.
"Lady Gamella, you should not be in this battle."
"But I am willing to fight," she insisted.
"Many animals may be hurt in the coming battle. If you would help me, you and I must set up a hospital at the rear of the army."
With a nod of understanding, Lady Gamella heeded Krogrog's counsel and agreed to stay behind the main battlefront. "Clean water, herbs, leafy stuff suitable for bandages, and other supplies necessary for treating wounds must be gathered," she ordered the other young maidens. Then Gamella swallowed the lump in her throat. The horror of the coming battle suddenly became real, and she prepared to face the life and death outcomes of their choices. When the animals were ready to march, Krogrog stood before the host.
"Captains Tlos and Zertelo will lead the main force. Once you engage the enemy, you must hold your ground until the second force arrives. But most important of all, you must storm CastleOak. Unless you take it and defeat Belfar himself, any victory gained today will have to be refought until Belfar has fallen. But you may have more help than you know of."
The wizard encouraged them and gave Zertelo a side wink.
"Hold together, and may you serve the light of the forest."
Zertelo felt gratitude beyond words for Krogrog's publicly addressing both him and Tlos as leaders. The animals, hearing the tortoise's rank from a wizard, would follow Tolos's commands. Zertelo knew that much of the ordering of troops would need to be done by the intelligent steed. In the thick of the fight, Zertelo might lose sight of the bigger picture in a way that Tlos would never neglect to see. Zertelo turned to the open battlefield. There stood the old muskrat he had rescued only a few days before. As the army advanced, Zertelo hoped the counselor would join their lines. Degilu stepped aside and watched the host of creatures pass. "Zertelo?" called the old muskrat. The lizard turned, and Degilu motioned him aside so no one else heard. "You could die, you know." "You could be free," Zertelo said, returned to the front, leapt onto his steed, and made for the last stage of his journey. Around the bend of Crescent Valley awaited a vast army, a tyrant, in a tree at the end of his quest. The assault on CastleOak had begun. Chapter 17. The Battle Begins. CastleOak loomed in the sky, towering over the forest like a mountain. The tree was circled by many crows and bats. At its base stretched a vast shadow. Then Zertelo saw it was no shadow, but a twitching black mass of spiders, forced into squadrons by their officers. They would not be held back for long. Zertelo's eyes traveled up the height of the trunk to the immense expanse of branches. No leaves grew from them. No color did it hold. Dark things crawled in and out of holes at all points. Doubtlessly it was hollow throughout. His heart filled with sadness as he gazed at the decayed symbol of justice. "Well, Tlos, this is the end of the quest." "But CastleOak is not meaningless," warned Tlos. "No, I still see where it was once beautiful. I wish I could see what it once stood for." A rumbling sound issued from the Black Army. The enemy general emerged, distinguished by a double-bladed battle axe. It was Zertelo's old friend. Radard took his place at the head of the Black Army. At the front of each battalion of spiders, Zertelo could see a rat in command. All were brothers of Radard. All the black forces were set. All waited. The first move was coming. Zertelo dismounted, turned to the animals, and said, "Captain Tlos will remain as a mobile center of command. Send sparrows to him for orders as the battle unfolds. Remember, we must hold our ground, but we must be flexible. Hold here for my order." In the pause, while the last creatures joined the rear guard of the formation and the hospital was set up, Zertelo stepped forward from the line and addressed the enemy commander across the open field. "You've changed, Radard," called out the lizard. I see your brothers are scared of you now." Radard glanced over his shoulder at the vast host amassed under his command. He nodded and said sarcastically, "Now ask me why, Zertelo." As though the sheer number of dark creatures was no reason at all, the lizard fixed his eyes directly on the rat and said, "Why, Radard?" "Because I am a general," answered Radard. "Are you yet a knight?" "I have one more test to pass," Zertelo said confidently. "Dreams and hope weren't enough," sneered Radard. "No, it also takes spirit, which even you could prove if you would come over to our side." Radard spun around, facing his troops. He hoisted the battle axe high over his head, and immediately the host broke into a roar. As he pumped his arm in the air, stirring the black army into a frenzy, Radard turned back to his rival with a mean smile. "You have your answer, Sir Knight!" Zertelo bowed and turned to rejoin his forces. One glance back at Tlos in the center of the formation told him all was ready. He lifted his sword and called out the order, "Time to advance!" They charged toward the rushing spiders. The two sides clashed in the center of the battlefield. It was all teeth and paws and excitement on the one side, and on the other side, all fangs and claws and rage. Zertelo squared off against his nemesis. The two friends met with a mighty clash. General Radard, wielding the heavy axe, proved stronger. He swung the double blade back and forth in great sweeping blows, but the lizard proved quicker. Zertelo kept his sword moving fast, making it hard for the rat to bring his heavy axe round in time to defend himself. When it was clear Zertelo was about to prevail, the rat retreated, leaving Zertelo alone in a sea of fighting. Soon Zertelo understood the tactic. Radard had drawn him into the open, so the chief bat could note the animal's leader and swoop down for the kill. The dive was already coming. Zertelo brought his sword up to the ready, hoping against hope. Suddenly, a bronze and gray blur shot over the lizard's head and up to intercept the bat's dive. Zertelo saw old Aladon catch the chief bat in his talons and swoop away with him. Von Nothgrar was never seen again. The cry went over the battlefield. "The owls! The guardians have joined the fight! The owls! The owls!" Zertelo cheered wildly. Suddenly he remembered to look for the enemy commander. The axe blade swung around at his head, and Zertelo barely had time to block the fatal blow. Radard's rage was beyond control. The rat swung violently, side to side, then up to bring the whole weight of the double-bladed axe down on the lizard. Zertelo allowed his body to accept the energy through his sword, down his arms, down his back, and out his legs. Using the arch of his tail to counterweight the roll, Zertelo was up in an instant, and Radard was pulled over by the momentum of his attack. Zertelo aimed a kick into Radard's back. Radard fell, the axe twisted out of his claw and flipped off crazily out of reach. From the muck of the battleground, Radard looked up at the lizard. Their eyes met. Zertelo wanted to look away. There was nothing of his old friend there in Belfar's general. Radard only radiated hate, and Zertelo felt pity for the miserable creature his friend had become. Zertelo lowered his sword and took a step back to give the fallen some dignity. Amid the chaos of battle, that small gesture was a great kindness, full of mercy, full of honor. It ruined Radard in the eyes of his brothers, the elite spider guard, and all the dark-hearted creatures. By pitying their general, Zertelo had subverted all rank and all its necessary prestige. The knight recognized a strength greater than ambition. Many animals on the two sides were watching. They saw the hollowness of Radard's soul, scampering to flee the fight. As the rat ran away, an owl dove on him. Then Zertelo closed his eyes. He heard the shrill cry of the guardian's justice and the sudden end of the coward's scream. Zertelo opened his eyes. Radard had shared the same fate as his father. He was gone, yet more black spiders remained as far as the eye could see. Inside the hospital pavilion, Gamella and Krogrog worked furiously tending to the injured animals coming in from the fight. Pallets had to be made for all the battered and bruised rabbits, otters, gophers, and porcupines who had fought bravely. A raccoon circled around frantically, causing confusion, shouting, "It was friendly trample! An armadillo ran over my tail! What am I going to do? Look, I can't walk straight!" Krogog became flustered trying to catch the ringed tail.
"If you would just calm down and stop tottering about, I'll mend it."
Suddenly Krogrog gave a loud croak, exclaiming,
"My warts!"
Several rats, black and grimy, had barged through the leaf flaps and were blocking the way in and out. Gamella leapt to put herself between the intruders and her patients. "What do you want?" Then she gasped. seeing the bloody state of the rat drugged between the two frightened rodents. "He's hurt bad," shrieked the bigger rat. Suspiciously, Gamella demanded, "Why have you brought him to us?" "Not our generals? Not the bats? Nobody made preparations for hurt animals on the other side. This rat is my friend, you see."
"And he's my nephew."
"Will you please help him? We'll do anything if you could just bind his wounds so that he doesn't die." The grumpy badger pushed his way in the front before she could answer.
"Gamella, I must protest. You can't be considering taking in wounded enemy creatures."
"After this battle, we will all have to live together." She nodded for a nurse to see to the hurt rat. "This fear of each other is the terrible wound, so deep and unnecessary in the heart of the forest. We'll begin healing it by healing this injured rat soldier."
"What if Belfar's army wins the day?" cried the old badger, "and all we've done is help him in the end?"
"I know the danger, but this is my final decision. All animals who come to this hospital will be given aid. See to it." Even the old badger responded to the decisive authority in her command. He and the others began preparing for the incoming rat soldiers. "Krogrog, can you start work on a second leaf pavilion for the wounded enemy?"
"Yes, my lady."
"Thank you, Krogrog." As the wizard hastened through the leaf flap, Gamella wheeled round to the two rats in the way. "Put together a litter quickly and begin running the injured animals in from the battlefield." "Yes, my lady, but—" "What?" she demanded. "There's not much time." "How will they know we're on the good side, my lady?" She gave the trembling rat a reassuring smile. "The way we always recognize one another, by our actions. Go quickly. Many will need your help now. Go!" A sparrow brought Captain Zertelo an urgent message from Captain Talos. The spiders had surrounded the host of animals fighting for the forest. They were cut off from their means of retreat. Captain Zertelo was to rally a contingent of hardy animals and make their way to CastleOak. There was no way back into hiding. Either they won the objective or they lost the war. Zertelo suddenly remembered Belfar. Where was the hawk in the battle? He looked and saw old Aladon and the Guardians were overwhelmed by a sky full of bats and crows. Then it happened. A loud hawk call sounded from the crown of the great tree, and Belfar came forth to battle. As Zertelo beheld the magnificent hawk in all its power, wonder arose in him. Commanding and noble and sublime was the breadth of its wings. So great was the size of the one bird that as its shadow crossed over, the animals cowered in fear. It took all of Zertelo's will to stay on his feet. To his amazement, Belfar appeared to shine. The surface of the hawk gleamed like metal, precious and fair. For a moment, Zertelo wanted to wish upon the majesty of that radiance, as on the pure light of a dragonfly. In that brief instant, Zertelo believed Belfar could grant his desires. Then Zertelo looked harder and saw the golden plume tarnished almost to black. He had only seen a glimpse of what Belfar had been. On powerful wings, the hawk crossed the distance of the field in only a few seconds. Belfar went straight for old Aladon. For a moment, the battle paused. Both sides bent their heads back to see the fates dueling in the sky, as though the hawk or the owl's victory would determine the destiny of all, for good or evil. Violently, the birds of prey clashed, wheeling in the air, stabbing and hewing and hacking with their beaks, slashing the flesh of the other with their talons. Compared to Belfar, the owl appeared slight, a dull smudge of bronze, hopelessly outmatched. Zertelo watched the brave fight of the owl, defeated by the hawk's size before the battle began. Indeed, all could see that the hawk was stronger. Yet the owl clutched the larger adversary for that one shot where his beak could strike the tyrant's heart and bring the evil down. They broke apart. Belfar swerved, climbing up in a high spiral. Old Aladon raced to catch him. The Guardian surged upward, closing the distance, but Belfar turned and dove into the owl with the force of gravity, slashed his claws across the owl's chest. The two cries severed the sky, domination and distress, as the hawk rose in the air and the owl fell to the earth. While most watched the tyrant circling above, Zertelo saw old Aladon's spent body strike the ground. "Aladon! Hold Aladon!" Zertelo cried, heedless of the battle through which he passed. Zertelo knelt, frantically searching for a sign of life. Only a small tremor in the owl's upturned wing told Zertelo of the spark left in old Aladon. The other wing lay broken underneath. Zertelo looked on the face of the fallen guardian, more noble in agony than the proud tyrant had ever been in all of his grandeur. What chance have we without you, Ol Aladon? Zertelo's eyes welled with tears. Who could prevail if not the Guardians? Ol Aladon heard these words and stirred. You, he said, you must climb the old tree to challenge him. But I'm so small, whispered Zertelo. The owl's eyes fluttered open to look at the night as Ol Aladon said his dying words. Not your courage. Chapter 18. Atop CastleOak. Roused by the honor of the fallen hero, Zertelo got to his feet. As he moved through the chaotic battle and towards the root of the great tree, Ol Aladon's words echoed in Zertelo's mind. Even as he died, the Guardian held his dignity and conviction, and Zertelo asked himself, what did he believe? Unhindered, he made his way to the foot of the towering tree. With one look back at the black army of rats and spiders surrounding the animals of the forest, Zertelo entered the hollow arch. The inside of CastleOak was dark. Dim light crept through rotten cracks in the trunk high above. It was vast and eerily quiet. All of its foul creatures had gone out to fight in the battle. The stench they left was awful. Zertelo braced himself for dangers that might be waiting in the shadows, but the real threat, he knew, would be faced when he reached the top. Up the stairs he climbed, spiraling along the inside tree wall to many chambers, balconies, and bridges, for the castle had once been beautiful and a marvel of all the forest. Now there were many rotten holes and broken places in the stair, and he had to cross on the sticky ropes of the spider webs, or jump the gaps with a quick pluck of courage. As he climbed, he thought of Walgarg's words.
Stupid little lizard! Have you asked yourself why the CastleOak is dying? Not by Belfar's power, but its own. What it stood for is not to be found in this world. That time is past, and it will not come again.
Exhausted, he slumped against the tree wall, black, lifeless, and twisted. Was this the symbol that represented the hearts of the forest? If so, what was the point of all of his labors, of going on? Zertelo looked up at the steep tower of stairs and despaired. He closed his eyes and collapsed on the narrow landing. But even as sleep threatened to overcome him, Zertelo opened his eyes, seeing that the task was to restore the forest, even in the darkness, to have hope and to not give up on the light. Zertelo forced himself, step by step, to go on. Suddenly the hollow trunk opened onto a forked branch, high above the ground, wide as a terrace where one could look out on the whole forest. He stood atop CastleOak, at the height Belfar had judged the forest. Zertelo had never seen the world from such a wide perspective. From here, he could see the world both as it ought to be and as it was. A voice somewhere, sleek and black, said, "You can make all of it better, if only you could bend all the lives to your will. Zertelo the brave, Zertelo the mighty." Then he focused on the forest and found his place in it, and the task given to him, perhaps one greater than he could bear. He wondered that the two such views were possible in one mind, for it came down to perspective, then choice, and lastly action. So at the end of his quest, he looked out on the forest and found it was too large for one creature to rule, and perhaps some of Belfar's hate came from knowing that. Across the valley, Zertelo could see the battle raging. One sad clump of animals stood back to back against the Black Army. Even from this height, he recognized the shape of the tortoise leading the last stand. Talos, steadfast and clear-headed, even in a ring of doom, held the remaining forces together and would not let them flee. Zertelo wondered what Talos was waiting for, why he did not order a retreat or a final charge. Enclosing the last remaining good animals were many hundreds of spiders and rats. The battlefield was strewn with the animals which had fallen, both good and bad. The spiders left the wounded on the ground behind them, sickened with the harsh poison of their bites. Rats left their victims with savage blows and cuts from their brute malice. It looked like Talos and those with him would fall. Then a mighty clamor of howls and barks sounded from the eastern tree line. Polyfire the fox came forth with the second army of swift foxes, squirrels, and rabbits. They drove a wedge north toward the main force of Talos. Zertelo's heart leapt with joy, and for the first time since Ol Aladon's fall, he felt hope return. But Lieutenant Ratfard also stood watching, clutching his dead brother's double-bladed axe. Zertelo watched as the fox neared the rat. If he could overrun him, thought Zertelo, and turn the tide in the animal's favor, At the last moment, Radard swung his brother's axe, catching Polyfire across the brow and sending the fox tumbling to the ground. Zertelo's hope fell as he watched spiders and rats trample the injured fox. Polyfire's companions fought bitterly to get to their captain. Though they were now far from aid and outnumbered, they helped the fox stand, and miraculously, he continued to fight. What should have been two separate forces joining together became three scattered pockets of fighting, for Zertelo saw that Polyfire's swift charge had left behind many small creatures of the Second Army. Along the tree line were chipmunks, gophers, and mice, all trying to survive the endless attack of spiders. Zertelo's spirit ran cold. The scattered animals could not stand for long. He hated to think he could only watch their end from high above, unable to help. Then a clear voice rang out amid the fray, calling for all the scattered animals to rally. A marmot of some kind was ordering them into ranks and leading the charge into the wall of spiders. But the small creatures broke on the black wall and were scattered again. And again the old marmot regrouped the mice, chipmunks, and gophers for a second charge. Zertelo's heart swelled. "Digilu has come around," he said. "Now he has joined the fight. He will not back down." Digilu led them. He drove his comrades headlong into the dark foes. Again they broke upon the force of the Black Army to no avail and were scattered. Zertelo gazed in awe as the old muskrat once again rallied the animals. Digilu led them. His third charge was fierce, with the animals unified in one spirit, and together they broke through to join Talos. This was the true meaning of CastleOak. Zertelo wondered that he should finally understand not by looking at the tree, but from it. He saw his fellow creatures choosing to act on what they knew to be right in their hearts, and he understood their virtue was the light of the forest. The three captains met amid the raging sea of blackness, Talos, Polyfire, and Digilu. Zertelo could see them draw their forces together near the tree's base. Talos had wisely gathered his strength in the exact position to separate the Black Army from their castle. Now it was the rats and spiders who were cut off from retreat. Victory seemed possible, even likely, but a warning in his heart told the lizard that though they might defeat the Black Army, if Belfar was not challenged, their victory would be brief and in vain. A stillness settled over him. Then he felt a gush of hideous wind as a mighty swipe of the hawk's wing told of the threat hovering over the abyss behind him. Zertelo turned and faced Belfar. The keen, gold-rimmed eyes regarded the small knight coldly, and Zertelo, sure of who he was and what he believed, looked back at the terrifying bird. Many feet separated them from the ground below, but only a few feet separated the two adversaries. All that he had, he gave. Untroubled with his own fate, the small lizard hurtled through the air. He crashed into the broad chest of the suspended hawk. Grabbing for a hold deep in the plume of the feathers with his left claw, he beat against the same thick feathers with the sword in his right, and found no vulnerability in the hawk's defenses. Desperately, Zertelo clutched the hawk as it tried to both fly and tear away the parasite with its claws. The hawk rose swiftly up, high over the towering tree of CastleOak, sweeping over the turmoil of the battle far below. Zertelo hacked with all his might, but still his weapon could find no purchase in the villain's flesh. All the while, Belfar's talons were snatching closer and closer to the lizard's body, but each time Belfar struggled to catch the small lizard, he lost altitude and had to open his body wide to beat his vast wings and climb back into the air. Zertelo finally understood what must be done. To draw the hawk's body into a position to strike at the vital area between the breastbone and the head, Zertelo would have to tempt Belfar to overreach by offering his tail. Zertelo tightened his grip in the root of the plumage, stretched out his back, and swung out his long blue tail. Belfar seized the opportunity. The beak closed around the outstretched tail and pulled. Pain shot through the lizard, but even as he made the sacrifice of his own body, the tyrant's neck also stretched out. Seeing the opening, Zertelo drove the sword deep into the hawk's throat. Belfar screamed, a gurgling wail of pain, followed by a cry of disbelief and fear. Then silence, as Zertelo felt the body of the bird to which he hung grow suddenly stiff. Zertelo knew Belfar was dead. "The tyrant is slain," Zertelo said aloud to himself, his voice carried away by the rushing wind. "And now the forest is free. I have fulfilled my task, and now we will fall together." He clung to the lifeless body as they hurtled down to the battlefield. The great form of the tyrant smote the earth with a mighty crash. Its wings drawn in, head bowed and claws twisted as though still trying to reach something nestled in its chest. All the animals gathered around the great heap. Both sides of the battle looked on in wonder, trying to understand the change that had come to the world, sensing that their lives would never be the same again. Counselor Dagiloo moved forward to see if the hawk was truly dead. Seeing the tyrant was vanquished, Dagiloo turned to the host, raised his arms, and cried, "It is finished! The forest is free!" Even as the victory cheer went up, it slowly died. Something stirred in the tangled mass of the hawk. From the ruin of the mighty enemy emerged a small figure. Zertelo stumbled forth, his tail broken and bleeding at the nub. On seeing their hero, the host of animals knelt solemnly. The rats who had betrayed the forest knelt as well. Even the spiders who had the wits to see they had been wrong bowed to show respect for the valiant warrior. Zertelo faltered. Counselor Dagiloo ran to his side, supporting him. "Behold, our champion, Zertelo!" cheered Dagiloo. "Zertelo! Zertelo the brave!" The host cheered as one. "Zertelo, servant of the light of the forest!" The lizard buried his face in his claws and wept as the realization of what they had accomplished swept over him. "Zertelo! Zertelo!" He looked up at the sound of the voices of his friends. Krogrog and Gamella had come up from the hospital pavilion to bear away the wounded and were running forward from the back of the crowd. He embraced them warmly, and then, remembering the friend who had helped him the most, Zertelo turned and saw Talos standing by quietly, watching with a kind smile on his gentle face. "Talos! Talos! The tortoise!" cried Gamella, and all took up the call so that the tortoise's name echoed throughout the forest. Gamella embraced her father. In time, she too would be elected to serve as a counselor, and the years under her guidance were a blessed time throughout the land. A night had returned. The creatures were united. Hope was everywhere, and so was the light. They all celebrated together. Chapter 19. A Night Returns. A long labor followed the downfall of the tyrant. Gamella and Krogrog continued to work in the hospital pavilion, for many animals needed healing from the injuries and weariness sustained in the battle. Their freedom had come at a great cost. CastleOak had to be uprooted and pulled down. More than any other, Talos emerged as the tireless leader in this task. First he organized moles and other friendly burrowing creatures to dig out all traces of the underground roots. Then, wrapping vines to the upper branches, many animals worked together, tugging in rows until the dead tree fell over and crumbled. The dust was scattered so that no one place would entomb the core of the corrupted symbol. Dagiloo questioned this. Would they be spreading evil to wherever it might go in the wind? It was Krogrog who settled the dispute, saying,
"The balance has been restored in our time. The tree itself was neither evil nor good. Only choices are. So scatter the dust, and trust the wind, and rain, and sun and moon, with the choices they make with their elements." With time, all signs of the battle and the tyrant were covered in a green field. Zertelo and Krogrog were walking together in the grass when the wizard stared hard at the lizard and asked, "How do you feel, Zertelo, at the end of your quest?"
The lizard swept his eyes around the place where his life had changed so much. His vision also swept inward, and he knew he had become the stern yet peaceful knight in his sword's reflection. Though the ancient symbol of the tree was gone, the green field still held a calling for him. He stared into Krogrog's kind eyes and said, "I don't feel it is over, but it has just begun. I feel only love for the forest and wish to see it safe."
"You have passed the final test, the test of spirit. Give me your sword."
Zertelo offered the hilt to his teacher and knelt. With the sword that had slain the tyrant, the wizard tapped the lizard on each shoulder.
"I dub thee Sir Zertelo, Knight of the Forest. Arise, my friend. We have a lot of celebrating to do tonight, and we'll need a lot of cricket juice to do it right. Roar!"
At last the day came when Zertelo was to depart, and something in his knightly senses told him to journey south to check on the animals there. The young lizard wanted to know that Forgotten Meadow was safe. Talos had chosen to go with him on the return journey. The three companions sat in the sun, recounting the events and many wonderful deeds of their quest. "One question still bugs me," said Gamella to Zertelo. "What was the answer to your wish from the dragonfly?" "I simply wished for help," answered the lizard. He looked long at his two friends and said, "And she sent me you." Gamella rose and embraced them both. "Until we meet again," said Gamella, with a tear falling on her disheveled whiskers. "Until then," the lizard and tortoise bowed low. "Farewell, my lady." Many animals came to see the two heroes depart. Counselor Degilu raised his paw in salute to them both, then turned to go, and as Talos let his eyes sweep the many faces, he commented that the wizardly old frog was not there to see them off. Crazy Crogrog was gone, but Zertelo knew this was not goodbye between them. They journeyed together back down the path they had come, seeing places they had passed before. The two friends would recall their adventures and often marveled that they saw the events differently in the light of experience. When they arrived at Forgotten Meadow, much to Zertelo's surprise, the rustic creatures of that small clearing on the far edge of the forest had heard the news of Zertelo's victory over the tyrant and of his becoming a knight. Squirrels and foxes and sparrows came out to welcome him home. They sang and cheered the heroes' names: Sir Zertelo, Knight of the Forest, and steadfast Talos, Talos the Tortoise. Zertelo's heart swelled, and he was deeply humbled by their unexpected reception. The lizard looked at the hollow log of his home and the sunning stone of his youth, and was glad to be back. Suddenly a rabbit tore out from the foliage at the edge of the clearing, disturbing the celebration. "Help! Help! There's danger away to the south!" cried the rabbit frantically. Zertelo's sword came out with a flash in the sunlight. "What is it? Of what peril do you speak, friend?" demanded the knight. "A band of scorpions raiding the south ridge!" cried the rabbit. Faces of all the animals in Forgotten Meadow pressed in to see how the knight would respond. The lizard looked away to the south for a moment. His back tensed, and his grip tightened on his sword. Just as it seemed he was about to spring into danger, Talos asked, "But what about your tail, Sir Knight?" Zertelo smiled confidently and leapt atop the tortoise's shell. "It will grow back," declared the knight, "and the adventure will continue." The end. This is D.S. Arnauld. I hope you've enjoyed this reading of Zertelo and the Quest for CastleOak, Book 1 in the series. Thank you for listening to this recording, with original music by Alex Bean. It was recorded at Kitchen Studios in Dallas, Texas. Production copyright 2023. Editing, mixing, and production by Alex Bean. The story continues in Zertelo and the Road of Fire.